What's going on, YouTube? Welcome to my channel, Money Moves with Kay. I am Kay, and today I will be interviewing Marshall Burns. He is from South Carolina. He is a tiny home builder. So, for those of you who are interested in tiny homes or affordable housing, this is the episode to watch of my channel. Okay. Without further ado, I'll kind of introduce him, and then I'll get into some questions that I have for him that hopefully you can find value from and help with your tiny home journey. All right. Hey, Marshall, how you doing?
Hey guys, how's it going? Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, a lot of my viewers love my content because I get straight into the good, juicy details of my questioning to try to help. But before I get there, I wanted to allow you time to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, so my name's Marshall Burns. I've been in the tiny house industry for about 2 years now. I mostly focus on tiny houses on wheels, but I actually just got my builder's license. So I'm actually starting a construction company, a residential construction company this month, or actually last month I just started. So I just started a company called Burns Custom Homes, but I do focus on like I want to build affordable housing and focus on tiny houses and stuff like that.
Okay, sweet. So you're the perfect person for our episode today. I like to get straight into the content. So, what would you say as a builder, from a builder's perspective? What would you say it costs to actually build a tiny home? Of course, you're going to mark it up on the end for the actual buyer, but how
Yeah.
much does it actually cost?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to answer that question just because there's so many options, so many sizes. It really depends on what people want. So with a tiny house on wheels, the biggest expense would be the trailer, which it depends on how big the trailer is. So you could get one that's 30 feet to 10 feet.
Okay.
So it depends on that. Typically, most of the tiny houses on wheels are all 8.5 feet wide. But so I'd say for a typical house around like 200 square feet,
Mhm.
just for the materials alone, you want to probably you could get one as low as 25, and then you could go up to, the sky's the limit. You go up to like 60 or 75. But I would really just, kind of focus on when people are budgeting and stuff, you kind of just focus on what exactly you want and what sizes, and then you kind of budget from there. But I'd say a good range for a decent sized tiny house that's pretty nice would be around 40,000 if you're doing it yourself.
Okay. And how is financing a tiny home? Are there financing options? For instance, if you're building
Yeah, so
yeah,
tiny houses, they're a little different because they're on wheels. So
right.
they're specified. Some of them are titled as trailers, some of them are titled as RV or recreational vehicles.
Mhm.
And then there's some tiny houses that are called park model tiny houses. So it's
Okay.
essentially a tiny house under 400 square feet, and those are titled differently. But essentially, what I'm getting at is that they're all financed like a car would be. So it's kind of like a
Oh,
loan that could be like 24 months to 96 months, and it's kind of the same structure as a car would be. It's not like a mortgage you would get for your house. It's a little different.
okay. So it potentially could be a little cheaper then, because if the tiny home is $40,000 as an example, if you're financing it in that manner, it may not be as much as a $2,300 mortgage, right?
Yeah,
Depending
yeah,
on terms, of course, credit and all that comes into place. And then there are folks who can't outright buy it in cash, correct?
yeah, there are. And that's the one issue with tiny houses. Like,
Mhm.
I'm gonna be straight up with you about all these answers. Like, it's pretty hard to get financing for a tiny house. Like, sometimes it can be difficult. You gotta make sure you find the right borrower, and two, you have to make sure the person you're buying the tiny house from
Mhm.
has like information, like certifications, how it was built, and just so on their end they're protected. So it's a lot of just like going to a lender, asking what they need, and then going to a builder and saying, "Can you provide this?"
Ah, okay, gotcha. So, how does zoning work? Because I actually saw on Facebook Marketplace. I like rummaged through Facebook Marketplace like a
Uh-huh.
geek, and I saw a tiny home someone was selling, and their issue was that they didn't do the reverse. They didn't check zoning first before they actually bought it, which meant that they were left with a tiny home and they were trying to sell it. So, for my viewers, I don't want them to get caught in that predicament because they do need to know zoning. Can you give us any information about land and zoning?
Yeah, so I get this answer all the time. So it's a difficult answer because it's kind of by town basis. But Essentially, what I always tell anybody before they buy a tiny house, find somewhere to put it first. That's like the number one thing you should look for before you even like you go searching for tiny houses. You got to find a place that you can put it and that you're
Mhm.
allowed to put it there. So the thing about tiny houses too is they're not a primary residence
Mm.
technically. So many municipalities, it depends. So you have to pretty much, I would advise anyone to go to their planning department and ask them what their rules are and what they should do. And the thing that's interesting is you can ask them and some of them they don't know because they've never had that situation come up. So it's a
Mhm.
little difficult because then you're going from nothing. But it's it just depends. I mean, some municipalities are fine with it, some are a little shaky about it. But
Right.
as long as you work with them and you give them like a solution, then
Mhm.
they'll work with you for the most part.
Well, what
But
is the hesitation? What is the hesitation like on my end? And that's happened in the counties that I've invested in. By the way,
yeah,
audience, if you don't know, we purchased a property and we're trying to put like an ADU in the back of the home or a tiny home, kind of similar situation. But a lot of the zoning department is kind of outdated. So these modern structures, such as a tiny home or a other structures in that manner, they don't have it on the books to say this is what we allow or don't. Right? Like a yurt, like they don't know.
yeah, exactly.
They're like, what?
Yeah, they're like, I've
so,
never heard of that. Yeah.
so what is the hesitation? Do you think is the hesitation on their end?
So, so my personal opinion, which could be wrong, is that for the tiny houses, is one, they're very new, and they're not. I think I think one of the big things why counties don't like them is because they're not like on a fixed spot. So like when
Gotcha.
it comes to zoning, it's mostly on like zoning and permitting. It's zoned on structures. So they get
Okay.
permitted, they get everything inspected, permitting for that. When it's a tiny house, it's coming in from somewhere else. It hasn't been inspected by their county, so they don't have any books on it. And two, if it's not connected to the ground, it's not technically real estate. It's just
Mm,
regular. I don't know what you would say, but I
yeah,
think the biggest thing is they can't tax it
there you
because it's not like
go.
property tax because it's not on the ground. So I feel like that's one hesitation.
Oh
And
yeah,
then I think the main thing though is just they don't know. They haven't been through the situation. So, and not many people have like gone through the hassle of making it. No one's gone through being a trailblazer in it.
yeah,
So it's just difficult starting out because working with the government and working with like all these like departments, it's hard to do something new because
for
you got to
sure.
go through all their checks and balances, which is good, but it's just like it takes a while if you're trying to do something like a tiny house.
What are the pros and cons to actually purchasing a tiny house on wheels, such as what you do, versus like building it from the ground up? Um, what's the difference for the audience? And then like, is one method better than the other or easier than the other?
Yeah, so I actually do both. So I build on foundation and with tiny houses. But I think the thing is about getting them, the ones that are on wheels versus the one on foundation, there's many checks and balances. Or I mean, there's many, pros and cons to each of
Okay.
what you want. So a tiny house on wheels, I'd say that's for someone who, has more flexibility. If they want to go to a different spot, they can
Mm-hmm.
move it. Whereas
Right.
if they had it on foundation, they would never be able to. So I think that's one big plus of the tiny house on wheels. And also, I think another plus is that it's cheaper to build depending on who
Mm,
you get. So I say that, but it really depends on if you build it yourself. Obviously, it's gonna be the cheapest way. But there's some people that just build tiny houses outright to spec, and they tend to be more cheaper, and they have other companies that build like quickly. And then there's
mm,
other people who build like high end custom tiny
mm,
houses. Is like what you
mm.
see. You go to a person, you're like, I want to build this, this, and this. That's where it gets really expensive. So the only
Gotcha.
thing is if you're trying to save money, it depends. If you do it yourself, you'd save a lot more money by doing a tiny house on wheels. Whereas if you build one on structure, one, you have to deal with the permitting and the zoning, whereas you wouldn't have to if you did it on wheels. And I
Mhm.
think that another thing about tiny house on wheels, people like it because you can stay under the radar.
Yes.
That's another big thing. Like people like that instead of the like on a foundation, just a regular house.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I've seen a ton of people stand under the radar and just kind of like, okay, I'm over here to the side. Don't bother me.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, if you're just living there, and it just depends on your municipality or where you live, and sometimes it works and sometimes it isn't. I mean, I always tell people to do it the right way, just so you don't have to worry about it. The only thing
Yes.
is, the right way is usually the harder way. So
Harder and longer.
yeah,
It's not such a quick and easy process, but
yeah,
it'll save you money and time in the long run for
yeah.
sure. Um, are tiny homes safe? It's a smaller structure. A lot of folks look into it, but are they actually safe?
Yeah, so the tiny houses we build, I can't say for all of them, is it's built with all the same materials as a regular house would be.
Right.
But I think when you say safe, I think of storm and climates and stuff like that. So what I would do is I would check with where you live, and I
Mhm.
would figure out what the load size needs to be for your roofs and stuff like that. And if you're parking it in a place more susceptible to storms and stuff like that, I
Mhm.
would look into getting like footings and tie downs for the tiny house. But yeah, overall it's safe. But when you're building, you just want to make sure that you know what the codes are in your area, and just tell your builder that, because they can add more protection like hurricane ties and stuff to your build to make it more safe.
Mhm.
It just depends. You have to be transparent about that, where you're putting it, and make sure that's a priority of yours.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, as far as choose or selecting a builder, what should a customer be looking for? What questions should they ask to find the right type of builder for them?
Yeah, so to find a good builder, I'd say first off, you have to figure out what you want. So some people want the full custom route. If
Hmm.
you want that, if you want like a perfect product, someone that's going to work with you, you look up, custom tiny house builders. If you just want a tiny house as the cheapest as possible,
Right.
then there's some builders out there for you. But I think the main thing is, yeah, first you figure out what you want,
Hmm.
and then the questions you need to ask are, what is your warranty for your product?
Hmm.
What is it certified? So there's two certifications. There's NOAA certification, which is pretty popular in the tiny house on wheels. Then there's certification for the RVIA, which is the Recreational Vehicle Institute, or something like that.
Okay.
But those are two companies that like oversee the building of the tiny house, so they make
Hmm.
sure that everything's done correctly. So you want to make sure you have that for not just your own, peace of mind, but also for financing or getting it insured. Those will help with hopefully lowering your rates. And then you want to ask, kind of just basic questions like the materials, what is the ceiling made with, or what is the frame made with?
Hmm.
Is it metal or is it wood?
Okay.
Just where the plumbing fixtures are, where the plumbing goes, where it discharges. And also another thing is, when you're building a house or buying a house, you got to realize where you're going to put it on a lot. So you got
Hmm.
to make sure the utilities and stuff are in the right spot, and where your dump outs and stuff are in the right spot. So those are just a few questions, but mainly I say just look for reviews, see if they have any people that referred them, and just do your own due diligence.
For sure. Now you mentioned materials. Are there any materials that you would suggest to use? Like if I'm asking, okay, what type of materials are you using for the frame or whatever?
Yeah.
Is there
So
one better than the other?
Yeah, so there's two main things. There's steel, there's like metal
Hmm.
frames that come in. So a lot of those are like kit made.
Okay.
So they come in like a kit, and it comes from the manufacturer. And if you're used to that, I mean, it's a lot of like screwing bolts. I personally prefer wood just because it's a lot more. It's it's a lot. The thing about steel, it's a lot lighter, so that's nicer. It's
Hmm.
a lot lighter than wood. But wood is just nice because if you mess up or you need to put in backing or blocking and stuff like that, it's a lot easier, more forgiving than what
Right.
steel would be. Also, another thing is, you got to realize if you're putting it on wheels and you're moving it around, you got to think about what the weight is, and like how much do these materials weigh. And I think drywall, that's a big thing, and like traditional houses and stuff like that. But I wouldn't recommend it in tiny houses just because it weighs a lot, and
Right.
it's not the best. And when it's a smaller space, it's like better to get like shiplap or something like that.
Okay.
But and then I'd say other things is just like realizing what siding, it's also like about looks. It doesn't have to all be like, making sure it's the right weight, especially because most people don't, drive around a lot. I don't think I
Right.
wouldn't recommend that for anyone, but it's just making sure, what looks good and what's going to be durable in the long run.
Gotcha, gotcha. That makes sense. Okay, I think I asked majority of my questions. My final question is: do you have any additional advice, money saving tips, or anything additional to add to what you've already discussed that could really, really help a viewer who's very interested in buying a tiny home, but they need more information about it? So, any other advice that you would like to provide?
Yeah, my advice would just be make sure, first off, I would make sure you want to do it because I
Yes.
lived in a tiny house for a year and it was a really tiny house. Like it was 16 by 8. So it was like as tiny as a tiny house gets.
Whoa.
And
Yes.
like it was fine, but sometimes it takes a toll on you. So you got to be like mentally prepared for it. And what I would recommend to people is
Hmm.
like go to Airbnb or something like that, or like try it out and then
Yeah.
see if you like it.
Right.
And then you can figure out from there is like, are you prepared to do it?
Okay, so you talk about that because I never thought about that. My audience doesn't know, but I'm like 6 feet tall.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
for me to get in a tiny home
Yeah,
with my
exactly.
family,
That's perfect
it,
because that's the thing is like when you get up in the lofts, you're like,
yeah.
oh wait, this isn't the same. But like when you build it yourself, you kind of can, make it, more accommodating.
Hmm.
But I would also just like make sure you before and if you're building, I would get ideas, just go to different places. There's so much content out there with like tiny houses and stuff, and just get ideas because like the number one thing about when you get a tiny house is like storage and where to put things. So that's a big thing. And then
Yeah.
just like, these little things you wouldn't think of. You see it in like a little YouTube video and you're like, oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's great advice to actually try it out first before just diving in and spending $40,000, for example,
exactly.
on a tiny home, and you definitely don't like it. And then it's
No,
like,
yeah, exactly. Because it's like people go into like Netflix and they see tiny house moving and stuff like that. They're like, "Oh, I gotta do it. This looks amazing." And
yeah.
then they maybe buy a tiny house, get in there, and they're like, "Oh, this isn't as amazing as I thought it would be."
For
But
sure, for sure. I
yeah,
think a lot of folks look at the price of it as well. It's like, I can do that. I'll sacrifice for you. But again, you just don't know until you actually get in one
yeah, that's another
and
thing.
live
Yeah,
in
with
one.
building, it's like you gotta have the experience and you gotta have like the will to do it because like it's
Wow.
a lot of just stuff. Especially if you don't have the experience, it's a lot of just learning and figuring it out. And it's just debating on it's everything's checks and balances. It's like, do you want to spend your time on it or do you want to spend your money? So
Makes sense.
biggest thing.
Cool, cool, cool. Well, Marshall, we definitely appreciate you joining us, and I'll leave Marshall's information down in the description. If you're interested in reaching out to him, he may be able to provide help to you. But
Of
until
course.
next time, guys, you stay blessed. I'll talk to you next time. Peace.
Bye guys.